The Sahara does not forgive mistakes, but it adores secrets. In the early 1980s, it was not merely the world's greatest desert, but a gargantuan chessboard heated to the melting point of weapons-grade steel. Here, amidst the shifting sands and black crags of the Tibesti Mountains, two superpowers engaged in a dance that history books would label a proxy war, while operational reports called it simply dirty work. Logic of the Cold War was devoid of sentiment. In Washington, Muammar Gaddafi was dubbed the Mad Dog of the Middle East. His ambition stretched far beyond Libya's oil fields. He dreamed of a Pan-African empire, the Green Book in every home, and Soviet bases on the shores of the Mediterranean. Chad, a destitute nation torn apart by civil war, became his ideal staging ground. But for Langley, Chad became the ideal trap. This is a story of how cynicism triumphed over morality and the speed of Japanese pickups outpaced the might of Soviet armor. In this game, there were no righteous parties. There were only interests, encrypted radiograms, and blood that bakes into the sand faster than one can pull a trigger. Welcome to the world of Black Ops, where a butcher dictator becomes a freedom fighter as long as he is shooting in the right direction. Chapter 1. Blood on the Awazu Estuaripe, January 1983. The air over Tripoli shimmered with heat haze and the roar of turbines. At the Aqaba ibn Nafa airbase, ground crews in oil-stained overalls finalized the preparation of a Tu-22 flight. These Soviet supersonic bombers, known to NATO as blinders, looked like alien predators amidst the scorched earth. Inside the cockpit of one, a Soviet military advisor, a colonel with weary eyes, checked the instrument readings. His task was both simple and complex: to teach Libyan pilots not just to fly, but to turn the Awazu Strip, the disputed territory on the border with Chad, into a glass-fused wasteland. "Remember, Captain," the colonel said through an interpreter, taking a drag from a strong Cosma cigarette, "your target isn't people. Your target is logistics. Turn their trails into glass." At the same time, 5,000 kilometers to the west, in Langley, Virginia, in an office overlooking snow-dusted pines, a different kind of cigarette was being lit. An operative from the Special Activities Division, SAD, named Richard, a man without a surname or an official biography, studied Landsat satellite imagery. The grainy black and white photos clearly showed columns of Libyan T-55 and T-62 tanks crawling south. "Gaddafi had officially invaded. He's taking the bait," Richard remarked, adjusting the frame of his horn-rimmed glasses. "Muammar thinks Chad is his backyard. It's time to show him it's the gateway to hell." Washington's plan was the embodiment of the containment doctrine. Direct confrontation with the USSR or its satellite, Libya, was out of the question. Nuclear parity dictated the rules. However, nothing forbade finding a local strongman and arming him to the teeth. The choice fell on Hissène Habré. Habré was no saint. A former Minister of Defense and now in exile and leader of the FAN, Northern Armed Forces rebels. He possessed a quality rare in African politics: a predatory instinct and an absolute lack of empathy. He was called the African Pinochet, and it was almost a compliment. For the CIA, he was the perfect instrument. The first phase of Operation Black Sand, a working title, as archives remain classified top secret, began with silence. In the port of Douala, Cameroon, containers marked as agricultural equipment began to be unloaded. Inside, beneath layers of oiled paper, lay not plows, but FNFAL rifles, Browning M2 machine guns, and the first shipments of radii manpads, the precursors to the famous Stingers. N'Djamena became the transit point. The Chadian capital in those days resembled a set for an apocalyptic film. The husks of burnt French Panhard armored cars, dust so thick goats floundered in it, and Haber's patrols in lizard camouflage eyeing every white man with suspicion. Richard arrived under the guise of a humanitarian mission representative. In his leather briefcase lay a portable satellite terminal, a marvel of technology for the time, allowing direct communication with Langley. The meeting with Habré took place in a low concrete building sandbagged against blasts. Habré smoked filterless gauloises, his narrow face with its hard cheekbones appearing as if carved from dark wood. "I don't need your lectures on democracy." Habré spoke in flawless French, exhaling a thick cloud of smoke. "I need missiles that down those cursed 222s and jeeps that are faster than Libyan tanks." "You will have them," Richard replied, maintaining the cold composure of a professional. "But in exchange we want total coordination. Our satellites will be your eyes. Our money will be your muscle. Gaddafi must leave Chad in a coffin or in disgrace." Habré offered a faint, thin smile. He understood the rules of the game. The Americans gave him power. He gave them the bodies of their enemies. Meanwhile, in the north, in the Libyan army camps, the situation looked different. Soviet KGB advisors attached to Gaddafi's headquarters began to record strange occurrences. Libyan reconnaissance groups were vanishing without a trace. Border posts were being cut down with surgical precision. But most alarming of all, the illiterate nomads, as the Libyans called the Chadians, were beginning to use communication systems operating on frequencies that Soviet electronic warfare units could not jam. One KGB agent, Major Sokolov, working undercover as an irrigation engineer in the Kufra oasis, reported back to the center. "A sharp change in the tactics of Habré's units is observed. They no longer flee from aviation, they wait for it." According to operational data, modern American-made air defense systems have been delivered to the region. Sources report the presence of U.S. intelligence officers in N'Djamena. This is ceasing to be a local rebellion. It is the beginning of a great game. The first major clash occurred near a small airfield in the north. A Libyan column consisting of 30 T-55 tanks and support vehicles moved through a Wadia dry riverbed. They were confident in their superiority. From the sky, 2 MiG-23s provided cover. Suddenly, shadows lunged from behind the dunes. They weren't tanks. They were dozens of brand-new Toyota Land Cruisers and Hiluxes. Mounted on the beds of these pickups were French Milan anti-tank missiles and heavy machine guns. "Fire!" commanded a Habré officer who had undergone training in a Sudanese camp under the guidance of American Green Berets. The first missile struck the lead tank, shearing off the turret like a lid from a tin can. The second set the rear vehicle ablaze. The Libyans were trapped. They tried to traverse their cannons, but the jeeps wouldn't stay still. They raced across the sand at 80 kilometers per hour, stinging and vanishing into clouds of dust. It was the hit-and-run tactic elevated to an absolute. One of the MiGs banked into a turn, preparing to rake the attackers with rocket fire. But at that moment, a thin trail of fire streaked from a rocky ridge. A Stinger missile, fired by a Chadian soldier whom Richard had trained only 2 weeks prior, found the heat signature of the engine. A flash, a second of delay, and the Soviet fighter turned into a fireball, crashing into the stones. In an office in Langley, Richard received a brief message: "Target neutralized." Toyota method confirmed. It was the beginning of the end for the Libyan presence in Chad, but it was also the beginning of something much darker. Habré, feeling the might of America behind his back, began to turn his country into a massive torture chamber. In the basements of his residence in N'Djamena, generators had already begun to hum, connected not to light bulbs, but to electrodes destined for the bodies of enemies of the regime. The cynical logic of the Cold War dictated, if he is our ally, we do not see what happens in the shadows. Richard closed the folder containing reports of the first executions. He had another task: to prepare the delivery of 200 more manpads. The Sahara continued to drink blood. The wind from the desert, hot and dry, carried the scent of char and cheap tobacco. The great gambit had only just begun. By mid-1983, N'Djamena had transformed into a city where silence was more dangerous than an explosion. The dusty streets of the capital were patrolled by men in sand-colored camouflage with rolled-up sleeves, clutching Israeli Uzi submachine guns and Belgian FN FAL rifles. The air was thick with a heavy, sickly sweet scent of rotting garbage, cheap diesel, and blooming acacias. But in the government quarter, behind high fences topped with barbed wire, it smelled different there. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and expensive French cologne reigned. Richard sat in the air-conditioned gloom of a CIA safe house located above a derelict warehouse for colonial goods. On the table before him lay a pack of Marlboro and a fresh report from Langley. Washington's primary objective at this stage was not just to oust Gaddafi, but to create a structure within Chad capable of holding power with an iron grip. "We need a control mechanism, Richard," the handler's voice crackled over the encrypted channel. "Habré is a magnificent butcher, but he needs a system. Create eyes and ears for him. We call this the institutionalization of loyalty." Thus was born the DDS Direction de la Documentation et de la Sécurité, Directorate of Documentation and Security. Officially, it was counterintelligence to combat Libyan spies. Factually, it was Hissène Habré's personal inquisition. The architecture of fear, the training of the first DDS officers, took place in an atmosphere of utmost secrecy. CIA operatives from the Special Activities Division conducted courses on interrogation techniques, surveillance, and informant management. They utilized manuals refined during operations in Latin America. The logic was simple. To defeat Gaddafi's pro-Soviet agents, one had to control every square meter of the city. Richard personally inspected the DDS headquarters building, which locals quickly dubbed the Pool, La Piscine. Formerly a mundane municipal facility, its basements had now been refitted. "We will install radio intercept systems and archivers here," Richard explained to the head of the DDS. Salah Yunus, a man with a cold stare who never removed his Ray-Ban aviators. Anyone whispering about Libya in the bazaar must end up in the filing system. Yunus nodded, stroking the blued steel of his Colt M1911. "And what of those who are simply unhappy with the rising price of flour? In a proxy war, any discontent is an enemy resource," Richard snapped. "Our task is rearguard stability. The rest is at your discretion." That discretion turned into industrial-scale terror. While American C-130 Hercules transports brought spare parts for Jeeps and KH-11 satellite intelligence to the N'Djamena airport, people began to be hauled into the DDS basements. Lists of suspects were compiled with frightening speed. Students, teachers, officials of the old regime, all were caught in the gears. The cynicism of Langley, Washington knew. In daily briefings for the National Security Council, reports of harsh stabilization methods employed by Habré slipped through. But Ronald Reagan publicly called Habré against tyranny, and State Department officials repeated the old Roosevelt mantra in the corridors. "He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch." For the CIA, Chad was the perfect testing ground. A new model of remote warfare was being trialed here. While Libyan 222s periodically dropped bombs on the N'Djamena runway, Richard and his team worked on creating a black network of informants. "Look at this," Richard handed a colleague from Langley a photo taken by a concealed camera. In it, Habré stood next to a heap of captured Libyan banners. "He feels like the Napoleon of the Sahara. If we give him too much rope, he'll start cutting his own ministers' throats. As long as he's downing Libyan mags with American missiles, we don't care what he does in the basements," the colleague replied, lighting up with a gold Zippo. "Gaddafi is in a rage. Moscow is demanding explanations for how their vaunted armor is burning at the hands of shepherds. It's worth any cost." Moscow's countermove at the Libyan group headquarters in the Awazoo Strip, Soviet KGB agent Major Sokolov was fuming. He watched as the Libyan army decomposed under the blows of an invisible enemy. Soviet advisors suggested reinforcing the group with T-72 tanks, but the Sand and Habre's tactics neutralized that advantage. They are using satellites. Muammar Sokolov urged the Libyan colonel. Every movement you make is known to them 2 hours before you set out. Habré is just a puppet whose strings are being pulled from Virginia. We need to strike their logistical hubs in N'Djamena. But Gaddafi hesitated. He feared direct intervention from France, whose Foreign Legion had already begun Operation Manta to cover southern Chad. The Sahara had become a layer cake of interests, where French Mirages, Libyan Sukhoi, and American reconnaissance planes shared the same sky. By the end of 1983, the DDS had become a state within a state. Richard saw Habré changing. From a field commander, he was morphing into a paranoiac despot. A television constantly blared French news in his office, and lists of those condemned to special treatment lay on his desk. One evening, leaving the DDS headquarters, Richard heard a scream emanating from a basement vent. It was a sound one never forgets, the sound of a life being beaten out of a man. Richard paused for a fleeting second, adjusted the collar of his safari shirt, and stepped into an armored SUV. To the embassy, he threw to the driver. A new shipment of Stingers arrives tomorrow. We need to prep the site. That night, a rare rain fell over N'Djamena, but it could not wash away the scent of fear that had permanently soaked into the walls of the pool. The great game demanded sacrifices, and the CIA was prepared to pay them with other people's lives. Chapter 3. The Toyota War. The triumph of SBED by 1987. The Sahara had become a graveyard for Soviet ambitions and Libyan iron. Gaddafi, enraged by the constant stings of the insurgents, threw his pride into the sands of Chad, an expeditionary force armed with the latest hardware from the Warsaw Pact arsenals. Along the 16th parallel, the so-called Red Line, battalions of T-62 tanks and BMP-1 South stood arrayed, sheltered by a canopy of Kadret surface-to-air missile systems. But Richard, sitting in the operational headquarters in N'Djamena, knew better. Steel is powerless against an idea backed by the Japanese auto industry and American intelligence.
It was the strangest army in the history of modern conflict. The CIA had insisted on purchasing hundreds of civilian Toyota Hilux and Land Cruiser pickups 40 and 70 series. In the ports, they were hastily painted Sanbei, and in the truck beds, Chadian and Libyan mechanics mounted heavy machine guns, and Milan anti-tank guided missile, a TGM. Launches. A tank is a heavy beast, Richard, Habré would say. Examining a map of the Wadi Dum fortified area, it sees far, but it is clumsy. My men are a pack of hyenas. We will not fight, head-on. We will bite their heels until they bleed out. The operation to seize the Wadi Dum airbase became a masterpiece of Black Ops. Wadi Dum was an impregnable fortress in the heart of the desert, protected by vast minefields and Soviet P-15 radars, but the Libyans had one weakness. They were accustomed to conventional warfare. Listen closely. Richard circled a satellite image with his pointer. KH-11 satellites have detected a gap in their patrols at 3 in the morning. That's when the temperature drops and vigilance fails. Your jeeps must cross the minefields at 100 kilometers per hour. That's suicide, one of the field commanders remarked. No. It's physics, Reacher retorted. At that speed, the pressure on the ground is momentary. Most anti-tank mines simply won't have time to detonate. The main thing is, do not stop. March 22, 1987. The pre-dawn mist barely concealed the silhouettes of the Libyan hangars. The silence was shattered by the roar of hundreds of Japanese engines. Habré, Toyotas, flew across the sand like demons. It was a cavalry charge for the late 20th century. Libyan tankers woke up to the explosions of their own ammunition depots. The jeeps darted between rows of T-62s, blasting them at point-blank range, with the Soviet advisors in Gaddafi's headquarters tried to organize a defense, but communications had been crippled by American electronic warfare systems. Major Sokolov, inside the communications bunker that night, watched the radar screen as hundreds of small dots swarmed the massive base. "This isn't an army. It's locusts," he shouted into a field telephone. "Where's the air cover? Why are the Mirages silent?" But the French Mirages weren't silent. They were coincidentally patrolling further south, creating interference for the Libyan radars. In the end, Wadi Dum fell in a matter of hours. The trophies were colossal: dozens of intact tanks, Mi-24 helicopters, and the most valuable prize for Langley, a brand-new Soviet radar station that the CIA was dying to strip down screw by screw. When the sun rose over Wadi Dum, the desert was littered with wreckage. The Libyan army fled in panic, leaving their boots in the sand. Gaddafi was humiliated. The whole world saw the photographs Habré-esque ragged fighters posing in front of scorched Soviet tanks, clutching American reports and packs of Camel cigarettes. In N'Djamena, Richard celebrated the victory. On his desk stood a bottle of Jack Daniel's whiskey, sent via a special flight from Langley. "We did it," his partner said. "Gaddafi is kicked out of Chad. His influence in Africa has been neutralized." Richard looked out the window. Captured Libyans were being driven down the street. They were led barefoot, hands tied behind their heads. Beside them walked DDS men, swinging rubber batons. "We've driven out one devil," Richard said quietly, lighting a Marlboro. "But we've raised another. Habré feels like a god now, and gods, as a rule, demand human sacrifices." That same week, Habré signed a decree expanding the powers of the pool. While the world marveled at the Toyota War, a new stage was beginning in the basements of N'Djamena, stage of total liquidation for anyone who dared to challenge the victor's power. The CIA looked the other way. Their mission was accomplished. The proxy force had worked perfectly. The victory over Libya brought Habré the aura of a national hero. But within the country, that aura quickly sharpened into barbed wire. By the late 1980s, Chad had become a laboratory of fear. While Western newspapers wrote of David slaying the Libyan Goliath, David was busy using his sling against his own people. Richard increasingly spent his evenings in the bar of the Lachari Hotel, the only place where one could find a cold Heineken and escape the sound of screams. But Ibn Eri, among French mercenaries and transient journalists, the clammy presence of the DDS was felt. In every waiter, in every Shushaner, the CIA saw the eyes of Saleh Yunus. The pool could no longer handle the influx of traitors. Habré began ethnic cleansings, targeting the Hejarai and Zagawa tribes groups that had once helped him rise to power. Reports smelling of formaldehyde and damp earth began landing on desks in Langley. Target president is exhibiting signs of growing paranoia. Arrests in N'Djamena have exceeded 200 persons per week. Interrogation methods at DDS include aerosage, forced water ingestion, and the use of truck exhaust fumes in confined cells. Recommendation: maintain technical communication support. Ignore domestic repression until further notice. Richard saw these lists. In one, he found the name of the interpreter who had assisted him during the seizure of Wadi Dum. "He's loyal to us." Richard attempted to protest during a meeting with you. The DDS chief merely adjusted his signature Ray-Bans and replied dryly, "He is loyal to you, but he doubts Habré in Chad. That is the same as working for Gaddafi." Richard remained silent. The cynicism of the situation lay in the fact that American taxpayers were effectively footing the bills for the DDS. The computers used to maintain death lists were supplied via CIA aid lines. Training materials on psychological pressure were being used to force mothers to inform on their sons. In 1988, the Cold War began to run out of steam. In Moscow, Gorbachev announced new thinking, and Libya ceased to be Washington's #1 threat. The CIA began a slow process of distancing themselves from their protege. "Richard, we're winding down the active phase," his handler informed him. "Habré has become too toxic. The French are already turning up their noses, and Congress is starting to ask questions about human rights. You're going to dump him after we made him the master of the desert." Richard smirked, flicking ash into a heavy ashtray made from a 30mm shell casing. "We aren't dumping him. We're just stopping holding his hand. If he can't hold on to power himself, that's his problem. The main thing is that the DDS archives don't fall into the wrong hands." But Habré had no intention of leaving. He felt betrayed. His office now smelled of Remy Martin cognac and cheap African cigarettes. He knew that without the support of American satellites, He was blind, and he began to kill even more ferociously, hoping that fear would replace the Stinger missiles. One day, Richard met Major Sokolov at the airfield. The Soviet advisor was leaving on the last flight to Moscow. They bumped into each other at the ramp, two enemies who understood each other better than their own politicians ever could. "You created a monster," Richard Sokolov said in broken English. "We gave Gaddafi tanks. You gave Habré the right to kill with impunity. Let's see whose legacy rots longer." Richard didn't answer. He watched the sun slip below the horizon, staining the sands of the Sahara the color of clotted blood. He knew that in a couple of years, Chad would be forgotten. Habré would become just another entry in the list of former dictators, and his crimes a folder marked "Destroy." After reading Inigo Zil, when Idriss Déby, a former Habré associate, trained by those same methods, launched a rebellion. The CIA didn't lift a finger. Habré fled to Senegal, taking the state treasury and the personal files of his victims with him. Langley breathed a sigh of relief. The Black Op was over. Or so they thought. December 1990. N'Djamena was choking on smoke as Idriss Déby's rebels entered the city in the very same Toyotas once supplied by the CIA. Hissène Habré was hurriedly fleeing his palace. In the cargo hold of his plane lay not only gold bullion but the shadows of 40,000 dead. Richard watched this unfold from the porthole of the last transport flight departing for a base in Cameroon. In his pocket lay a Zippo lighter, embossed with the emblem of the Special Activities Division, a souvenir from a world that had just ceased to exist. The Cold War was over. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The Soviet Union was cracking at the seams, and African sons of bitches were no longer needed by Washington. Habré settled in Dakar, in the prestigious Wakam district. For 20 years, he lived like a respected pensioner, praying at the mosque, sponsoring local football teams, and smoking expensive Cuban cigars. He believed in the unspoken code of intelligence. He who is useful to the system shall never stand trial. But the world changed. The cynicism of the 80s gave way to the legal activism of the 90s and aughts. In the basements of the abandoned pool and the new authorities discovered the DDS archives thousands of neatly filed folders where every murder and every torture session had been documented with bureaucratic precision. The American computers had preserved everything. They found the lists. Richard, an old colleague's voice crackled over a secure line from Langley to a private home in Virginia. Human rights. Watch activists are digging into Habré. Our methods are surfacing there. We taught him counterintelligence, not sadism, Richard replied dryly, looking at his aging hands. Who cares? 30 years later. If he talks in court, the stench will be so bad we'll all be answering to a Senate committee. In 2013, the noose tightened. Under pressure from the African Union and the international community, Senegal established the extraordinary African Chambers. It was the first time in history that a dictator was tried in another African country for crimes against humanity. The 2016 trial resembled a surreal thriller. Gray-haired and wrapped in white robes, Habré sat in the courtroom, demonstratively ignoring the judges. He shouted that it was an imperialist plot and a neo-colonial tribunal. But when the survivors began to enter the hall, those who had endured the DDS cells, those tortured with electricity and choked by exhaust fumes, the silence in the room became visceral. Richard watched the broadcast in his study. On the screen, he saw the faces of people he had once considered mere collateral damage in the grand game against Gaddafi. Life imprisonment, the announcer declared. Habré was led away under guard. 5 years later, in 2021, he would die in a Senegalese prison from COVID-19. The dictator who had survived 222 airstrikes and desert charges fell to an invisible virus. The operation in Chad remains in intelligence textbooks as a brilliant example of a low-cost war. For a few $1 million and a fleet of pickups, the U.S. obliterated Libya's regional influence and dealt a stinging blow to the prestige of Soviet weaponry. But the price was different. Chad remains one of the poorest countries in the world, where power is still handed over through the barrel of a gun. The CIA was left with the stigma of having midwifed the DDSA, an organization whose level of cruelty horrified even seasoned operatives. The archives remain classified. Many documents regarding Langley's direct role in supporting the DDS between 1982 and 1990 were lost or heavily redacted. Richard stepped out onto the veranda of his house. The Virginia evening air was cool, nothing like the scorched breath of the Sahara. He lit one last cigarette. In his mind, the image of Wadi Doom flickered. Burning tanks, the roar of Toyota engines, and Hissène Habré standing against the desert backdrop with an American missile on his shoulder. It was a massive canvas, painted in blood and sand, and on that canvas, there was no room for remorse, only for the logic of power, which always finds a new excuse for an old evil.